My name is Michael Eggiman, and my project and presentation is based on a critical analysis of the Deaf President Now movement and similarly related protests. Specifically, my core research question is, what happens when identity is at the center of student-led protests against university administration? I chose this question and its wording because it has a core direction and narrow focus. Identity has become a topic and facet of health and wellness that gets discussed and covered in the news more and more as time goes on. I sought out to discover how identity influences these protests from both sides of the topic. The two ensuing questions I had and consequently developed are, how much power do the students have, and are these results reason for celebration, concern, or both? Through my research, I have arrived at several definitive answers regarding the first question. However, as we will see through the presentation and my findings, the final question is up to you, the university decision makers, to decide. In order to move forward in my research and presentation, I need to operationalize my key terms. I defined identity as the distinguished characteristics, personality, and/or traits that collectively form an individual and/or collective group. I arrived at this definition through an academic health activism research paper. In my own terms, I would characterize identity in my research as one sense of the self that can stretch farther than the individual. People experience different examples of hardships and events, but their similar identity combines to form a larger sense of being that is shared amongst peers who identify with the same identity. As for my second key term, I define power as the ability to change or influence, specifically the ability of students to affect universities and their decisions, and the ability of universities to control student-led protests' effects. As my presentation moves along, these latter and specific components of the definition will become clearer as I provide tangible examples and analysis. Power in the sense of my research is not what we may initially think it to be, which would be the ability of protesters to gain attention and the ability of collegiate leaders to end the protests. Rather, I will be using power to refer to long-lasting and broad impacts that one side has and garners through the protests. My analytical approach included two different types of analyses. First, I used discourse analysis to see how universities responded. This stretches beyond just their word choice and tone. I am more focused upon broader responses that will become clearer as we move along. Secondly, I used data analysis specifically for my second example school. This is a very linear approach, and it will paint a very clear picture of the tangible effects of the protests on the university. The starting and focus point of my research and presentation is Deaf President Now. I chose this as the center because it exemplifies identity being a major factor in student-led protests against university administration. It also demonstrates the power the university can claim from the protest, even if it may initially seem otherwise. In order to understand Deaf President Now and its implication, it is imperative to look at the background information. Gallaudet University is a university for the deaf and hard of hearing located in Washington, D.C. Gallaudet was established in 1864, and until 1988, it had never been led by a deaf president. When the incumbent president announced his resignation in 1987, many deaf organizations and advocacy groups began campaigning for a deaf president by writing and publishing articles and mailing letters to the Board of Trustees, the group that was entrusted to select Gallaudet's next president. Students first formally organized on March 1, 1988, at a rally attended by 1,000 students, staff, and alumni, and was primarily organized by flyers. This was the first time many students and members of the deaf community became aware and consequently involved in the movement. There were other gatherings that promoted the desire for a deaf president in the following days. However, what is commonly referenced as Deaf President Now did not begin until a few days later, when the board announced its decision to hire a hearing president. The board announced their decision on March 6, and many students and other individuals on campus marched to where the board was meeting to express their frustration and disapproval. The meeting did not yield any progress for the protesters' demands. On the following day, protesters blocked off entrances to campuses with cars, buses, and human bodies. The protesters were able to organize and coordinate well enough that they very clearly outlined four specific demands. First, The newly appointed president must resign and a deaf president must be selected. Second, the current board chairperson resign. Third, the board must be comprised of at least 51% deaf individuals, and at the time it was only 19%. And fourth and finally, there must be no repercussions taken against the students and staff involved in the protests. The board initially refused all four of these demands, which resulted in the protesters marching on the Capitol building. The following day, the protesters allowed people to have access to the campus, but many boycotted classes. The day after that, the staff voted to fully support the protest. On Thursday, March 10th, the movement had visibly spread as a student representative appeared on Good Morning America, and students from another deaf school had traveled to join the protests. Later that night, the selected president resigned. On Friday, March 11th, the movement had its largest formal act as over 2,500 individuals marched on Capitol Hill. Finally, on Sunday, March 13th, the board announced that all four of the demands would be met, effectively ending the movement. Deaf President Now demonstrated the desire of the deaf community's identity to be recognized not just by the school, but on a national level. They wanted to showcase how deaf individuals can exist and function in society just the same as anyone else. It was this sense of identity that attracted many people to come protest who were not enrolled students or employed faculty members. It also caused it to gain national attention, and this was even before the creation of social media. The students clearly had power as they were able to get their demands in a short period of time with little to no visible repercussions. However, Gallaudet has also been able to obtain power through Deaf President Now in a very abstract and hidden way. The two images on the slide are screen captures taken directly from Gallaudet's website. Deaf President Now is listed under the History and Traditions page under the About Gallaudet page on their website. There is a plethora of information about the facts of the protest and its aftermath. The website portrays the protesters as brave individuals, but the school also does not concede or address whether it was definitively in the wrong. Gallaudet has seemingly claimed the protest and made it part of its history and tradition. They even organized a 25th year anniversary of the protest to attract people back to the school. Gallaudet has the power over this protest as they get to control what is said about it. My discourse analysis reveals that by proudly discussing Deaf President Now, the school can make both its students and the university look good. A similar and contemporary example of a similar protest is the protest that occurred at the University of Missouri from 2015 to 2016. While it is also a vitally important protest, I will be looking less at the history and timeline of the protest and more so towards its implications and the findings I discovered concerning it, as Deaf President Now is still the focus of my research. It provides a critical comparison between different approaches schools have for addressing these protests and how one can produce objectively better results for both sides. After several racially charged incidents and the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, the student government president of the University of Missouri addressed his concerns with his school's lack of action towards addressing hateful attitudes against racial and sexual minorities possessed by some at the school. For several years, and including the time immediately after these racially charged crimes and happenings, university leadership only offered words, as they said they would not tolerate this kind of hateful behavior and promised to implement policies that would articulate exactly that. However, as time passed, nothing changed, and the students became increasingly aware and upset at this. This would spark several larger physical protests, as well as hunger strikes and the football team threatening to sit out its game, which would have resulted in a $1 million fine. The protesters' demands were that the university president resign and the school implement policies to increase racial awareness and to address bigoted attitudes on the campus. There were other incidents with the university's president, specifically ones that demonstrated that he did not take the protest or its demands seriously. Eventually, the protests accomplished what they sought out to do, as all of their demands were met with the resignation of the university president and its chancellor, and the gradual implementation of desired policies and programs. However, unlike Gallaudet, Missouri did not and cannot claim this protest as of right now. Because this took place in 2015 and not 1988, there was a lot more streamlined media coverage, especially with the existence of social media and the connectivity the country shares. As a result, the school suffered even more consequences for its inaction and reluctance. The school sustained a 40% decrease in African American student enrollment between 2015 and 2016 alone. Enrollment for incoming freshmen is also down, and they do not hope to reach what it was prior to the protests until the year 2023. However, it is important to note that the school has appointed diverse leadership to address the students' concerns, and the school is making serious and legitimate progress. In fact, the transfer rate of students at the university is stable and at the same figure it was prior to these events. The discourse and data analysis show that the school suffered serious reputational costs because of the digital age, and that is what is hurting the students. The protest had a stronger impact on prospective students than it did on its current ones. The protesters had all the power because their actions strongly directed the actions of the university. Had the university taken the identity and the claims of the protesters seriously, it would have saved itself from worsening its stance in the eyes and minds of not only its students, but of the country as well. The school also implemented a $35 million budget cut that would get rid of almost 200 jobs as a result of the decreasing enrollment. This particular example highlights how protesters' power can be a cause for concern, as the people who suffered the most from this protest were workers who got caught in the crossfire as a result. A current example is also at the University of Texas at El Paso, which is commonly abbreviated as UTEP. It is a historically Hispanic school, and their board recently appointed a new president who is affiliated with the Trump administration and has a poor track record of voting strongly against LGBTQ plus rights. There were protests when they announced her as the president-elect, and after the mandated 3-week waiting period, she was installed into power. Since then, there have been no reports of protests that I could find. This may show that times are changing and that schools now have the power over protests even when identity is involved. This also may be a cause of social media simply not covering this protest, and so it does not have the influence that the University of Missouri protests had. It will be an interesting case to monitor as time progresses. My primary findings have three components, with the first being that schools should not underestimate the strength of student-led protests. This is especially true in the digital age, as information is transmitted too quickly and schools cannot control the message that gets sent concerning these protests. Secondly, behaving proactively can lead to short-term and long-term benefits. Nobody talks about the poor treatment of deaf students at Gallaudet because the school responded so quickly. Additionally, the school is now able to use this protest as part of its history and lore. The students are appeased, and the school benefits from the protest as they use it to improve their image. Comparatively and finally, behaving reluctantly can lead to short-term and long-term consequences. Had the University of Missouri acted swiftly, the protest would not have been as widely covered in the news. The football team did not join in until towards the end of the protest, and their actions caused the conflict to be covered in major news outlets like ESPN that would not otherwise have been picked up by these news outlets. The university could have saved itself immediate embarrassment and bad press, as well as serious and long-term detriments like a dwindling enrollment and budget cuts, had they just responded with actual action in a timely manner. As we have seen through the examples, identity-based protests can have a broader jurisdiction than the campus. This is true now more than ever as constant media coverage and the digital age has increased pressure on universities. If schools responded quickly and with actions rather than words, they can produce immediate and long-term benefits. Universities can claim the power from these protests if handled correctly. However, there may be a shift where universities already have the power to begin with. My name is Michael Eggiman, and thank you for receiving my research, findings, and presentation.